Okay, welcome to House Education Tuesday, February 11th, 2025. Basically the rest of the afternoon is really kind of open committee time. First hour we'll sort of talk about scale and achieving scale and thoughts, but we have nobody's presenting. I'll kind of kick things off, but I really want this to be just a discussion among ourselves, questions and answers. Beth is here as a resource for some things. So to just kind of, I don't know, as we say, set the table or whatever, I think that there are areas that we can all agree on regardless of party. And one is that we have an affordability issue in Vermont, that property taxes are part of that, and that property taxes are directly related to education spending. And that education spending is something we need to get under control and perhaps find some relief for taxpayers. I think we also need to talk about getting better outcomes for what we do. And I think these are all themes that the governor has hit repeatedly, and I think that they are all themes that we can sort of agree on. And scale and educational performance, in a way, go hand in hand, according to a lot of the research, especially when you talk about minimum class sizes and things like that. So what I thought is maybe we'll take a look back at some of the testimony that we had from the Vermont Superintendents Association, kind of get a better understanding of their ideas of scale, like how do you get there mechanically or just sort of like process-wise, and see if we can take that and think about it, talk about it. But just more right now, I've asked Beth to sort of look at some of the policy recommendations, but the testimony from the Superintendent Association was about using tools in place such as district quality standards, educational quality standards, to achieve scale, to frankly impose scale as a standard. So, like they said, under district size and governance, establish ideal district sizes of 2,000 to 4,000 students within district quality standards. The 2,000 to 4,000 comes from their research and what they believe the research shows as ideal district sizes. We, of course, everybody knows we've got them all over the place, from super tiny to that size. But Beth, can you talk a little bit about how district quality standards work and how you would say we want districts to be between 2,000 and 4,000 and put that in district quality standards, and then sort of like what happens?
Sure. That's St. James Office of Legislative Counsel. So district quality standards are a relatively new concept from a legal standpoint. In Act 127 from 2022, which was the Pupil Weighting Act, which adjusted all of the pupil weights, Section 13 and 14, all the way on page 22 of Act 127, established district quality standards. And there's very little in state law to guide anyone on what exactly they should be. And here's why I say that. So, district quality standards lives, the requirement that those be in a rule lives in 16 VSA section 165, which is the Education Quality Standards statute. So the Education Quality Standards are subsections A through F, and then G is the last subsection that was added in Act 127 in 2022, and that is what requires the Agency of Education to establish district quality standards. And I'll just read it to you, it's very short. In addition to the education quality standards provided in subsection A of this section, each Vermont school district shall meet the school district quality standards adopted by rule of the agency regarding the business, facilities management, and governance practices of school districts. These standards shall include a process for school district quality reviews to be conducted by AOE, and then annually, the secretary is required to publish metrics regarding the outcomes of the district quality reviews. That's it.
So, I'm sorry.
You jump in, that's fine, this is just.
Right, it's discussion. So there's nothing specific.
So that is your legislative directive to the Agency of Education to engage in rulemaking. That is there was a piece of so that's what the statute says. In Act 127, there was a piece of session law that required AOE to engage in rulemaking, but there wasn't any additional direction from the legislature and what that included. It just required rulemaking to update education quality standards. Oh, actually, that's education quality standards. That's it. So what I just read to you was the direction to the agency to develop rules. And you'll remember from all of our discussions thus far, that is currently the only area that the agency has rulemaking, specific rulemaking authority in right now. So they underwent rulemaking under the Administrative Procedures Act. And those rules are the district quality standards, and they do not take effect until July 1, 2025.
Oh.
They are 10 pages. The first, I'm not saying this in any, actually, why don't I just share my screen instead of using my words?
That would be great.
Okay. Bear with me. The short answer to all of this is, if there's anything done through rulemaking, that is a delegation of your legislative authority to an administrative body, an executive branch body. And so you have the ability as the rulemaking branch of our three-legged stool of government, right? Judicial, legislative, executive, to require amending rules, to require updating rules, to pause implementation of rules. You ultimately retain all of that authority, so you can give further direction to update or change or amend whatever word accurately captures what you are looking to do, even though the author of those rules is an executive branch agency, because you ultimately hold that law-making power through, and you delegated that authority through rulemaking.
So if we were to say, this, if the legislature were to say, you know something, we want districts of this size, schools of this size, classes of this size, we could, as one tool, order the AOE to include them in district quality standards.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, like most of it, we don't know is like, what happens, then what happens?
Right.
Which is,
Can I ask a
Oh, yeah.
just a timeline question? The agency has one section that they rulemaking. When were they given that?
in the 2022 Act 127.
Prior to 2022, there was no rulemaking that you know of.
So I think the Agency of Education, by virtue of being an executive branch agency, kind of inherently has rulemaking authority if you were to delegate that authority.
Right.
The state board currently has the broad requirement to write the educational rules in their powers and duties rule or statute. And historically, the State Board of Education, prior to Act 2020, prior to 2012, owned all of those rules. And so I don't believe any rulemaking authority has ever been transferred specifically to the Agency of Education. So without that legislative transfer of authority, those rules still stayed owned by the State Board of Education. And so it's really a policy decision for you all who owns those rules. You could decide today to ask me to draft something that transfers all of the rules that are currently under the State Board of Education to the Agency of Education and ask them to update them, sunset them, do whatever you want. You could pick and choose, you can have a hybrid. It's really all policy, and those policy choices are going to be built on larger policy choices, right? Over what is your vision for the state level education governance system in general? Whose responsibilities where? What rules do those, what responsibilities have rules attached to them? And so who needs to own those rules in order to fulfill their duties as state law has ascribed to them? It's just like an onion, right? It's layers upon layers. But yes, right now, as far as I am aware, the district quality standards is the only, if you will, live set of rules that the agency has engaged in rulemaking on right now.
And just a little history. At that time, then Secretary Dan French came in to the legislature as we were going through 127. Said we would like to start a new set of quality standards really focused on governance and administration as opposed to educational quality, that sort of thing. And, clearly made a good enough argument that it would be something that would be housed solely within the Agency of Education, and the legislature went along with that.
And here they are. And I'm happy to send a link to Annie for posting on your website.
That'd be great.
But it starts with, as most rule series do, the authority for these rules. And it's exactly what I just walked you through, section 165, subsection G, which was added in Act 127 in 2022. There's a statement of purpose. So I did not draft these rules. I'm not gonna walk through you. I'm just gonna kind of highlight the topics that are in here to inform your discussion.
Great.
So there's a statement of purpose. And then there's a definition section, so we're on page 3. And then about 2/3 of the way down, page 3, we start with what the quality standards are. And you can see there's a business operations section that includes budgeting and accounting, risk management and internal controls, personnel management, data management, then we move on to facilities management and safety, facilities safety, then governance priorities, governance protocols, governance processes, quality assurance. So this is the quality assurance process. It starts with a self-evaluation. And then the agency can require more, and then every 3 years, the agency is doing an evaluation, not less than every 3 years. And then there's an enforcement section. So if a supervisory union, and these rules are built on the supervisory union, supervisory district level. So these are all requirements for SUs and SDs to be managing. If an SU or SD fails to take corrective actions identified that within 2 years of the date of notification, the agency can make recommendations and then to the state board, and then the state board can take certain actions that they can take in section 165, subsection B, which are essentially what happens if the schools are not following education quality standards.
Mm-hmm.
And this is right out of state law, what can happen. And then publication of metrics, and then that's it.
Great. Helpful, thank you. So that is an avenue that is open. So again, if we were to pass a law that says all districts must be between 2,000 and 4,000 students, and we said that it will be required through district quality standards. And so what would you see as, what would be the logical next step? It could, because I'm thinking that you just told us that district quality standards apply to districts, supervisory unions. If one is of insufficient size based on this and there's another, what is there to sort of make them come together in a directed way as opposed to an Act 46 sort of voluntary merger way?
Well, I think I'd have to ponder this a little bit more. My initial reaction, which is a dangerous thing for a lawyer to say, especially on YouTube, is we are potentially getting into some delegation of authority, some constitutional issues here. You would, if the question, if I am understanding the question correctly, that is, what would happen essentially if you ask the agency to update the district quality standards to just include a directive that each school district or SU, whatever level or name you're putting on it, contained no more than 3,000 students, or between, no less than 3,000 students. And if it doesn't happen before a certain time, then there are all these penalties. You would essentially be delegating authority to create municipalities, and that is tricky and potentially unconstitutional, depending on who you are delegating that authority to and how much direction you give them.
What if the authority was given to the state board of education?
So that's what happened in Act 46, and we do have a Supreme Court case on this, Athens.
Oh, right.
So Act 46 gave everyone directives of what the state, the legislature, wanted to see for school district governance, and then incentives and directives and timelines to get them there. And then it gave the Agency of Education authority to look at the lay of the land, figure out who's meeting the goals of the legislature, who's not, and they made a pitch to the State Board of Education, and then the State Board of Education was empowered to merge districts, to create new structures. Mm-hmm. And there was a challenge to that delegation authority, and we have a Supreme Court case that says in that specific example, based on the history of education in Vermont, and the history and the role that the State Board of Education has played, and some of the differences between municipal law when we think of it in its purest form and municipal law when we think of it when we think of education governance, and the specific direction that the legislature gave the state board under Act 46, and I believe it was Act 49, which was the follow-up a year or two later, which provided additional direction, that it was not an improper delegation of authority. So many things had to be in the right place for the Supreme Court to make that finding. But it does give you some considerations if you are thinking of delegating any authority when we're looking at consolidating school district governance on what would need to be in place to pass constitutional muster. But as we all know, the law evolves, right? You get different judges on the bench, you get different, conversation or evolution of history, or even conversations in your committee that are focusing on legislative and being used to infer, legislative intent. And even if you think you've got everything lined up, the court may not agree with you, right? So we can try and make things bulletproof, but you're never going to make things bulletproof because the judicial branch decides what's constitutional, not you, right? That's a very long-winded way of saying there is a Supreme Court case on this that helps us figure out how to do that, but it's in a very different context.
So given that, I'll just throw a concept out there, given what you just said. People have batted around the idea of something equivalent to the Federal Base Closure Commission that had the authority to, they probably didn't have the authority, they probably came up with the list and Congress followed through, but to essentially say these military bases should close because they're no longer needed and we're trying to consolidate and save money. If we were to come up with that concept and empower a panel to be the nonpartisan group of people to make decisions of drawing lines and sizes of districts, we have no history of that other than what you just described. In that case, it was the State Board of Education that was empowered. The State Board of Education has a history of the power to draw district boundaries. So
They have a history of being involved in the governance of education in Vermont. I don't remember off the top of my head if there was a history of drawing district boundaries. But they were so integral to the history of education in Vermont that it was a different analysis for the court than just any old non-legislative body.
So do you have any reaction to that concept, which since we were on this idea, I wanted to throw it out there to see where it falls within the context of what you were just saying.
I would want to think about it further and get back to you.
Yeah.
I've made a note.
You have to eliminate the judicial branch here, make our work easier. Go ahead, Josh.
And that'll be used against you.
So, to make sure I'm understanding you correctly, you're talking about instead of the legislature setting the district lines, we are going to delegate our authority to somebody else to do so.
Yeah, basically.
Why would we do that?
Well, and I don't want to go down this rabbit hole too far. It was just a concept I wanted to get Beth's reaction to. Are we the ones who are best equipped to say, this school should really be with this school? Are we the ones best equipped in our limited time to have maps spread out and start drawing lines? So that would be why. You could have an independent, nonpartisan body, which is what we do with base closures, looking at data and evidence and maps and feeding zones, if we want to use some of our new terminology, to do that.
Yeah. But would it make sense to still do that, but then they bring their proposal or proposals to us to make that final decision, since that is our authority?
I mean, would that? I guess would you ponder that in your pondering? Is it the way to do it to say this commission is really just providing a recommendation to the legislature, but it's ultimately us who has to make that call?
And Peter, could we say, in that we would say, this is what we're looking for, average class size, district size, the whole bit, and optimization of all the numbers that we've been fed these last bunch of weeks.
Right.
The base closure.
Like I said, I wasn't intending us to go down.
Oh, no, because
but mechanically, I think what Josh was just saying is that you don't give them the power to do anything besides make a recommendation.
They make a recommendation.
We look at that and we make the decision based off the data that's been provided.
I'd say you do that all the time.
We do it constantly. I was just going to say, we just do that all the time.
Yeah.
And the reason why we delegate authority is because somebody else probably is a better entity to do that.
Right.
That's why
Right.
we delegate.
And we do have the authority to
Yes.
make those decisions. 'Cause
Right.
you said, the voice holds, we can do whatever we want.
I did.
But then anybody can sue anybody about anything.
Right. I
You're
did.
learning.
Those are the,
Right.
those are my two
Find out
lessons.
your work is paying off, Beth.
So I did notice in the rules we just looked at briefly that if they're not doing corrective action, that redrawing supervisory union boundaries was one of the things that could happen under these rules.
That is already a State Board of
Yeah.
Education power, is the drawing SU boundaries. SU.
Oh, that's different than districts because SUs are not municipalities and districts are.
Correct. Ding, ding,
Oh,
ding.
Got it. Okay. I can learn. All right. Then okay.
You got it. Yep.
I'm gonna, since we're kind of pulling this thread, I'm gonna pull a little more. If we were to move to a different funding formula, where you're just receiving money as a school district, and you are no longer voting on a budget, do you need to be a municipality?
Oh.
Ooh, how about that one?
Taxes.
Oh, that's nice.
Okay.
Good one.
That's a good one.
However,
Goals considered?
that brings up the question of local, being able to raise local funds.
Yeah.
Right, let's take that off the table for
That's the
now.
next.
So if you got rid of that completely.
I think it would depend. You still need to raise. My understanding is that all of the. I think there is a world of possibilities in which money is not funding education through property taxes, right? In which case, I think that's a whole separate conversation. But if property taxes are still a part of it, I think there would have to be someone who has the ability to raise property taxes to fund the education system. Is that the school district? Is that the state? And how is that set up? So maybe.
Because that did come up in the conversation, the funding formula, when it came to budgeting. They don't vote on the budget, they vote on the tax rate in some of these states.
Right. Right, but in many states, you don't vote on anything.
Or anything at all.
Usually just if it's an X at a sort of, they might call it something different, but essentially an excess spending threshold. There's, in many places, I think there's a vote, or some places, I shouldn't even say many, and then bonding, bonding.
That's
So
where we fall,
absolutely-
that's where it falls
It's
apart.
absolutely
Is school
voted on.
construction and
But
funding.
the actual budget and then your tax rate related to it is not a something that is voted on by the general public.
Okay.
I don't want to move on unless people feel like, I thought that we would move on to class size minimums. And that's more of an EQS thing, but sort of how that would work.
Am I talking now?
Sure.
Okay.
Go ahead. Brady, were you about to say something?
Well, I don't know what my question is. I feel like we haven't exhausted that topic.
We can bounce back.
Alright.
So, if this committee were to say, we feel that class size minimums is probably the most accessible tool we have to drive scale, how does that get in, what are the sort of tools available to us to implement that using the structures we have in place today?
I think you have a lot of tools there because I don't think you don't have any constitutional constraints on that. I say that, but there is, and we won't talk about it today, but it has to do with contracts.
Right.
You could put it in statute, right? You could create incentives, right? If you do this, then you get these incentives. You could ask someone to update rules. You could have a whole separate rule series on class size or staff to student ratios. You could ask for the education quality standards to be updated in relation to class size and school ratios. You could I think you could implement different policy levers that would potentially lead to the requirement to make different staffing decisions. What those are, I don't know because I'm not your policy gal, but I can imagine in the universe of possibilities that you could put in place a series of laws, whether they be permanent or temporary, that force decisions to be made funding is one piece, right? If you create a funding model that only allows for a certain number of teachers to be paid, then you are perhaps leaving it up to districts or whoever's making those decisions to figure out how to do that without any direction on what you would like to see, what the outcome you would like to see. But when we're talking policy leverage, that's kind of what I'm saying, right? You could force hands. But I think that the clearest way would be through some sort of law, whether it's statute or rule. And the education quality standards are kind of a natural place under our existing structures.
Unlike what we saw in district quality standards, I do not believe, what is the enforcement mechanism of educational quality standards?
So the enforcement mechanism for district quality standards and education quality standards is the same. So, and let me share my screen again. And this is nice because there's a statute.
Bless you.
Okay, so this is, avert your eyes while I scroll. This is section 165 of Title 16, Education Quality Standards statute. And it starts with, in order to carry out Vermont's policy that all Vermont children will be afforded educational opportunities that are substantially equal in quality, each Vermont public school, including each career technical center, shall meet the following education quality standards. And then there's a lot, right? So what we think about, I think the most when we think about education quality standards is here. The school substantially meets standards adopted by rule of the state board regarding conditions, practices, and resources of schools. The standards shall address those aspects of the following that are most closely associated with improving student performance. This is the directive to the State Board of Education to create the education quality standards. Can you see that? Okay. Yeah. And these are, when you hear the term EQS, this is what most everyone is referring to. So there's a rule series that is owned by the State Board of Education, but there's also the statute that contains all of the directive to the state board, along with some more specifics, including the enforcement mechanism. So annually, the secretary is required to determine whether students in each Vermont public school are provided educational opportunities substantially equal to those provided in other public schools. If the secretary determines that a school is not meeting EQS, or that the school is making insufficient progress to improving student performance, the secretary shall describe in writing actions that a district must take in order to meet both of those standards. And if the school fails to meet those standards or make sufficient progress within 2 years, then the secretary shall recommend one of these things. The agency continue to provide technical assistance. The state board adjusts supervisory union boundaries or responsibilities of the superintendency. The secretary assume administrative control over a school district, or an SU. The state board close a school or require that the school district pay tuition to another school, or the state board require 2 or more school districts to consolidate their governance structures. I don't think this has ever happened, and all of my constitutional concerns would come to light here. But again, there is quite a bit of direction provided by the legislature to get there. So that's the enforcement mechanism. And then there's an opportunity for hearing, so there's a due process portion here. And then everything after subsection E, D, and C are basically kind of the due process portion of that enforcement mechanism. And then F is about independent schools meeting education quality standards, and then you just get to G, the district quality standards, and that's it. That's all the education quality standards statute. You can see how many times they've been amended over the years.
Couple of times,
but the last time it was amended, you can see, was Act 127 for the district quality standards. And before that, they were not amended since 2017. And I do not know off the top of my head what that was. I believe this is the follow-up to Act 46. I believe this is the further direction. And I believe that enforcement piece is baked right into the rule series as well. But again, that statute, you control that. You can change that, you can amend it, and you could direct further rulemaking with whatever legislative direction intent that you were giving them. Them being the rulemaking body.
Right. In this case, presumably the state board. Erin?
I guess this is just a question for AO, put out there that we're all maybe thinking about, is that it seems like there is a on paper, robust sort of accountability system towards our shared standards. And we heard testimony several weeks ago from the Vermont Principals Association that in many ways EQS are sort of our vision for education. So I guess I will be curious to ask AOE if there's any schools that have taken any of those steps with, because as I read the whole governance proposal over the weekend, accountability comes up again and again and again, and it's not quite clear what they're suggesting for accountability, but it makes me wonder, like, what accountability doesn't exist that they want or that we would want? Are the accountability measures that we have being used? Not really a question for you, that's me.
No,
That's me thinking out loud because it just really struck me.
I will tell you that they did reach level 1 on their enforcement, which is to provide continuing technical assistance to at least one district in southern Vermont.
Oh, yes, they certainly have.
Next year.
And others have been contacted.
Yeah. Other thoughts, folks?
Just that, yeah, it seems like EQS is the place to house whichever direction we go in.
This will, I would say, let's just say we go there, thank you, and talk about, it at a minimum, if we want to accomplish something this session that really gets towards scale and whatnot. Act 46 put a lot of pressure and a lot of work on the state board. I would say if we're going to add to that, if we're going to do that again, we need to do it in a way that resources them appropriately. Got anything?
Just given the simple math with that, if we stayed at about 4,000 students per district, we're talking about 20 districts.
20 districts, and we are now at, we use either 119 for districts. I would probably say it's more accurate to say we're at 52 right now because that's how many superintendents we have, supervisory districts. So that's still a dramatic reduction.
Well, on the low end of 2,000, you're talking 40. 2,000 doesn't make much of a change.
Right. Go ahead.
So we got that proposal from Representative Byron and I can't remember Edie's last name.
Granted.
Yep.
And that was for what, 17 districts that aligned with.
No more than 25.
Oh, but it aligned with the tech.
That's
Am I
Jim
thinking-
Harrison's.
Oh, that's Jim Harris. So we've got two different things. Okay, so are we not considering then the tech one because that would reduce it to a very specific number?
Oh, we can consider anything.
Or I guess what I'm saying is, does it make sense to decide first whether or not we are or aren't considering that one since that had a very specific number that aligned with certain, I'm just thinking about the process.
Right. So, I mean, you think about all the things that are for us. We're soon going to have a short form bill that represents the governor's proposal. It's a short form bill.
Right.
Doesn't have the 300 pages of stuff that it actually needs to fill in the gaps. We've got the Harrison proposal that went along CTE lines, I think.
Yeah.
We have the Byron grading proposal, which I can't even remember. It was more just a number of districts than it was lines. There are people who say if we want our designated agencies to be vitally involved in our schools, we should design it around the borders of our designated agencies. So we have a whole menu of, we've got the VSBA lines, for example, which, again, they're like the superintendent lines. They're drawn to create regions to hold meetings.
Right.
But they took the time to draw lines so that they are inclusive of, it sort of holds districts together, rather than chopping them off at a county line, which is, since we never use county government for anything, it's kind of arbitrary.
Didn't we also get the one district? Where
That's
I was just looking at that. We just got that too, the one district. So it's all over the place.
Yes, but what that really means is we could take any one of those and say, this is the bill we're going to take up and we're going to change the numbers and add to it where we want. We can create a committee bill. These are all, we're sort of in control here to forward the debate.
Okay.
But we're going to have to figure out what path we want to take.
So in rewording my question, I guess I would be like, I don't understand maybe why it wouldn't make sense to start with, all right, let's look at the Harrison proposal. Why not go with that proposal? Because it's too big or because it's too small? And then
I would say we don't have to
Okay.
use any proposal. What we can say is we can ask whomever we want, and that's my big question for everybody here.
Okay.
Who else we want to hear from? We can say, oh, what about 14? What about CTE lines?
okay.
We run into an issue of like, who do we ask about that to get some testimony in? Yeah.
What I'd also like to try to find out is from the Ways and Means Committee, how us drawing district lines with the different sizes affects how the foundation formula
Absolutely.
is
Yeah, yeah.
formulated, right? So we got this proposal in front of us with 5 districts. How does us varying from that affect every other piece that's
Right.
made out?
Gotcha.
Which did sound like Zoe had said that if you don't go with the 5 districts, everything changes, right?
Right.
So you have to recalculate. Right?
Yep.
But did it, and maybe I'm misunderstanding, but she said the JFO had the information to do so, where they could actually do the calculations if we gave them the data to do it.
My understanding is that they can model us to a certain extent. If you pull this lever this way, what does that do over here?
Which might be, it's a lot of
I
work,
mean,
but
you know, I realize, just really runs through my mind, I realize modeling, all that is vital. Data is vital, but there's a sort of baseline. If we have fewer districts and we have larger scale, that's going to require fewer human beings, and that's where the costs are.
Right.
So it at least puts you on the track towards a savings.
That's the assumption.
That's my assumption, yes. Reality is
It's
always
not your assumption, it is the assumption
Yes.
that people are making, because a lot of people have that assumption. I'm not yet. That's why modeling helps.
Yes.
Because I'm not sure, you know.
Yeah, it's sort of like the,
public transportation and all the other things.
You know, I've got a friend who just moved here from Hawaii where he worked in the school system. He's like, yeah, it's one district, but it's
Yeah.
highly bureaucratic.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
I'm not sure there's any real savings there. Well, we'll give everybody a little 10-minute
Yeah,
brain break
thank
before we
you.
go into construction.
Good.
But I just want to say, people are looking toward us to move forward. I think, you know, the big proposal is challenging. There's so many gaps that need to be filled in. And we're a time-limited organization here, and we want to take some steps forward. And so we need to think about those steps that we can take, where the gaps don't all need to be filled in, and how we're going to do that.
Right.
Yeah. And makes our brains hurt. Okay, let's pause and we'll come back at 3. We are back at House Education, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, February 11th, 2025. Moving into a committee discussion on H.129, which is the school construction bill that was the result of the legislative task force that worked on it over the off-season. So the question is, the big question is, what do we want to do with this? How integral is it in people's minds to the bigger question of reform? Where are the areas that need to be adjusted in the bill, which I think we've talked about a lot. But anyway, I'll leave it at that and open it up to thoughts. I'm going to start off with Representative Brady.
I feel like I want to go draw on the whiteboard for this.
That means you have to erase it.
I know, can't do that.
Teachers.
So instead you get to see my hand emotions. I think it's integral, but I'm a little bit stuck on what the next steps are, because if, as I conceptualize sort of where we are and where we need to go, we have talked quite a bit about district sort of size, capacity. We have one proposal. We've heard from quite a few witnesses and modeling that somewhere in the sort of 3,700 to 3,900 is really your kind of ideal district size. The national average is 3,700, so quite a bit smaller than what's in those 5. But I think we have some consensus that we need fewer districts than what we have. 5 maybe too few. I think is too few in the way that they are created, but there's work to do around some district consolidation and realignment, which we just got another reminder of how complicated it is, even if that seems simple. And then on the sort of class size level, this is why it would be on a whiteboard, at the most sort of local level is, you know, the class size piece, which again, we have quite a bit of testimony on from last session and this session. We have great research to draw on the sort of educational impact of class size. And it leaves sort of in the middle school size, which to me feels the most challenging. The research might be clear about ideal school size. Class size is hard because we are talking about humans and teachers and like there's going to be changes there, absolutely. District size is hard in a lot of ways, but school size is hard because it's also actually the physical footprint of the, you can change how many kids are in a room without changing the room, more or less. You can change sort of district stuff without changing the physical layout of a district. District offices don't have the same constraints that an educational space like a school does. The school, where we actually deliver the education, is really linked to the physical infrastructure of that building too. So it's really hard. And if these two things are going to put some pressures on or help us to right size our system in some ways and probably consolidate and merge some schools, there's going to have to be some physical realignment of resources to just make that possible. There are schools that have excess space. There are some schools that are really tight. I've spent quite a bit of time in South Burlington lately, and we have some overcrowded schools. But you can't really do that middle level without some physical adding to buildings, building new buildings, changing buildings, infrastructure stuff. So I'm stuck on this being a really integral piece of the whole pie. I don't have a better answer kind of what pieces of the policy, but to say that we're going to sort of start putting some pressures on or some goals to improve our system and to gain some efficiencies is going to create pressure in that middle at the school size. And to say that then you have to somehow do that without the resources is, I think we're setting up sort of the impossible here. And they might not, we may need to build, or we may hope to build some new regional comprehensive high schools, but it also might be more simple things. Like if we're putting 2 or 3 elementaries together, one might need another wing or a slight reconfiguration, not a whole new building, but it's going to need some physical work to make that possible. So it feels very disingenuous if we are doing a whole bunch of transformation and we're talking about the actual footprint of our system and we aren't addressing construction. It feels like it's just a really disingenuous kind of policy step to the field. So I guess I say that more as like we have to figure this out.
Yes.
But that also means the money. We have to figure out how much and how we pay for it.
Does anyone want to disagree with that?
I want to add to that
Okay.
because I think there's an assumption that, just a general assumption, that school communities don't really want to close their small schools in their communities, and I think that's a legitimate assumption. But I also think that there's 2 things that play a great role in the pushback on closing your school, and that is the inability to merge with another school because of transportation and because of the cost to fix your buildings up. The other piece, because at this moment in time, through articles of agreement, school districts are not allowed to close schools.
Right.
Communities have to do it. And when that happens, communities don't know what to do with the building itself. And when they don't have a path forward with the building itself, now this isn't really school construction aid, but if we don't recognize the challenge, they're not going to vote to support it. So I actually think that incentives to help a community overcome the loss if we're gonna go that route, I think school construction aid is number one, because right now, people have their children in schools that are in very bad shape.
Yep.
And they want them in a school that's in better shape. And I don't think there's a parent out there who doesn't agree with all the testimony you all took about the size of schools and what's the optimal environment for their children to get. They want a good education for their kids. So I think school construction aid has got to play a role here, how much we can afford to put into it or whatever. We shouldn't forget that other municipal side of this, because it is a stumbling block.
Does anyone disagree with that? So what I'm hearing is a general consensus that, yeah, it's hard to move forward with change without this being a part of it.
It's not that I disagree with any of it. I think that like the placement of where it comes into play is more what I'm thinking. Like, yes, it's important, but do we need to make strides towards the direction we're going with districts, class sizes, make those strides before we can start needling in on the construction piece? Because what we do there is go, like, if we go to 5 districts and we go to certain class sizes, right, at some point, what's the inventory of schools we need, right? And that's going to dictate maybe where we're willing to do construction or we're not willing to do construction because of that change. So that, I don't think that can't come until we, in my opinion, until we actually have somewhat of a close decision or on our way to a decision of the districts, the schools, stuff like that. I think.
Well, I just, from a logistical point of view, I would just point out that one thing that this calls for is that if you want to qualify,
Right.
there's a process.
Right.
And it's actually probably a 2-year process to get on the list.
Yeah.
So I think that you could move ahead with district changes before this would need to. We could probably do this and do that at the same time, and they would come together.
I'm not saying we wouldn't. I'm just saying like one might, the other might dictate some aspects of the construction.
Absolutely. I think that's why we need an advisory board. And I would also just remind everybody that the study that was done shows that we have an immediate $6 billion need for school
There you go.
construction.
Not current.
And it's one of our cost drivers, so every year, I mean, the challenge every year that it isn't addressed, and there's no way we're gonna begin to address the scale of it, but it is adding to the underlying budget pressures
Yes.
year after year after year, because whether they like the building or not, the kids have to go to school.
That's right.
And so we've gotta keep the lights on, the water that's dripping from the ceilings collected, whatever it is, but we're continuing to maintain them. Not to mention what we're doing with PCBs around them, but to maintain them, just to keep, because kids have to go to school.
Chris?
Yeah, I appreciate what Rep. Doberich said too. There's no doubt we need this put in place. We need school construction put in place. We need to figure it out. I don't think us doing the other pieces is in any way dictated by us having this put in place or not. I think we have to have it regardless on if we move forward with anything or not. Right? And I also think that what we figure out going forward with this whole proposal could organically make some things happen on the way with possible, consolidation of schools just organically. But regardless, we need this put in place now as soon as possible, I think. But I don't think one really dictates the other.
Well, the concern would be how much money do you spend on construction on a building that may end up just being closed anyway? So having that priority list, going hand in hand, you need both, so that it's like, okay, where are the dollars going to go? What are the priorities?
So I think that speaks to the importance of the advisory board, whose job it will be to keep an eye on all of those factors at once.
If we
Yeah.
decide
Well,
the advisory board, as Ledge Council keeps reminding us too, like, the most powerful tool here would be statute, right, and we don't have to necessarily see that. I realize the draft we've given you has that concept in there. It's the one I think that got murkier and murkier the closer we got to the end of our work.
Do we want to tackle, so maybe as we discuss this, let's tackle the mechanics of an advisory board and how it would work, probably first.
Can I ask a question about why an advisory board over the state board of education? Or when you say advisory board, could it be the state board of education?
I don't know, I don't know if we heard specific testimony.
It was, yeah, we had very limited, they came in, kind of gave some quick informal testimony, I think.
Their testimony was they didn't have the capacity.
In the current, in the sort of current role,
But we could provide them.
we could provide that, we could, if it is, so I just talked about district level, school level, class level, then like above all of that is what's happening at the state level, right? State board, AOE, and legislature, so I don't, maybe it's further resourcing or.
Maybe we start at the top.
Or targeting work from the state board.
I suspect it may also be a question of not capacity, number one.
Yeah.
And number two, do you want a higher level of expertise in this one area
Right.
on the advisory board?
Legislative council was there pretty much every meeting, maybe John remembers any of that reasoning? Sorry to put you on the spot.
John Gray, Office of Legislative Counsel. I zoned out for a moment, so.
Yeah, we were
I'm on the spot.
sorry. We were talking about the Board of Education.
Oh, just-
Instead of the advisory board, why couldn't the Board of Education handle what the advisory board was?
Sorry, I thought you had a more specific, okay, I did hear this question, I didn't zone out. I can't say why the group didn't elect for that to be the piece. I do recall exactly the testimony that I think you stated, which was that there might be capacity lacking. And I know that there had been some concern about particular public-facing elements, which maybe you could achieve through the state board. I think another piece of this was that the proposed composition of the advisory board includes a member from the Vermont Bond Bank, which might be something that you want to have input on, but that's not to say that you couldn't leverage the state board in some way and then have input from. So I would just say, in my duration on this working group, I never heard a real appetite for the state board to be serving this advisory function, but there's nothing that says you can't do that.
Josh?
Maybe you said that like the advisory board, especially if it has some people with expertise in the area on it, could actually make decisions quicker and more efficiently than going to the Board of Education, which has many things on its plate. So maybe that's another reason why this would be beneficial too. It's something that has such a need now, it can help expedite that process instead of decisions kind of lingering.
I'll just go over the composition as it's listed. 4 members who shall serve as ex officio members: the treasurer, the commissioner of buildings and grounds, or buildings and general services, executive director of the bond bank, and the chair of the state board of education. Then 4 members, none of whom shall be legislators, 2 members appointed by the speaker, and 2 members appointed using the Senate method, committee on committees. But it does say, each of whom shall have expertise in education or construction, real estate, or finance, and 1 of whom shall represent a supervisory union, and 1 of whom shall be an educator. So I think sounds like there really was an effort to bring a level of expertise to this advisory board.
I just want to remind everybody that this board, this committee was brought to us, initially started off having much more teeth than an advisory board.
Yeah.
It was a gatekeeping to rulemaking as well. So there was a lot more to it at that point. And as we went through the process, it got turned into an advisory committee in its current capacity.
Do you want to talk a little bit about why you went that route? I know we sort of had the conversation previously.
We can. I actually, I think maybe it was one of the ones that agreed with the gatekeeping model. So that was kind of, I appreciated having that kind of safety net in place.
I mean, gatekeeping in the sense that they would be the rule makers?
They wouldn't be the rule makers. The AOE would still be the rule makers, but the board, as it was first presented to us, would basically have the yes or no on that rulemaking. Would decide if that rulemaking was going to be put in place or try again.
Basically like veto power.
Veto power, correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I think some of the thinking there was the oddity of that structure to have a segmented process where someone, the agency, has the opportunity to go through formal rulemaking, but has to check in with someone else before they can proceed through that process. And in particular, there was a functional concern about, and of course you could change the advisory board's meetings, but whether the board as set up would have the capacity to handle, particularly if you think of this as something that's meant to help kickstart the program, right? It's time limited in duration. Would they be able, in 6 meetings within a year, be able to serve as an effective gatekeeper, or would they actually be holding up the process and delaying implementation of the program? But of course, you could address that by changing the number of meetings too. So I think there are functional concerns that went into backing away from that gatekeeping piece as well.
Does this commission exist?
No.
This committee? Oh, okay.
Imagination.
This was in theory.
It's just a proposed.
This is in theory,
advisory
okay.
board
It's very,
bill.
it's pliable, right? I mean,
Okay.
that's what
Yeah.
we're gonna decide on here.
So, to your point before, this would be the group that we would go to, and after we all hashed it out and said, this is what needs to be designed, these are the goals, these are the numbers you need to we need these recommendations, like that's the input, we can feed that in and say, have at
It's
it.
got a number of charges, I think, in here, but correct me if I'm wrong, it's essentially to say, does it design the bonuses? Or does it implement the bonuses that we design?
In all instances, it is advisory. So the AOE is tasked with developing each of these pieces, but in statute, at least currently the proposal is that this board would have a key role, at least as envisioned. Now, maybe they don't comply with this, but that's the vision behind this, in helping with rulemaking for the program at large, developing project priorities and proposed legislation to kind of tweak the system over that 10-year period. So trying to course correct, make sure that it's right, off on the right foot. But yes, they would have a say in your orientation of the program. And I would just call out again what I said last time, and I think where we ended before. You guys have the opportunity to take a stance on those project priorities and bonus incentives. That's something you can do, and I think that you are equipped to do if you don't want to leave that to the rulemaking process as advised by this envisioned advisory board.
Would you look at the intent section here? I guess, do we have we don't have an.
The statement of
We have
policy at the very beginning of the bill.
Oh, it's the intent, yeah.
I mean, I suppose that's where we got the clearest.
Is that under John Gray's?
If it's helpful, I can also screen share.
Just search for H.129.
Yep, I got it.
It's the one under
Today's.
John Gray.
It's today's.
I got it.
Online.
I mean, maybe that's another way to think about this in the statement of policy, prioritizing cost, geographic accessibility, 21st century facility standards, enrollment trends, capacity, and scale. Like, who are the right people or the right positions to focus on and execute those goals?
So the way it reads right now is there is the intent statement there. The AOE would take that intent statement, develop a program in concert with the advisory committee, which is advisory only. And then whatever they came up with, they would then move into rulemaking. There's no real check back with the legislature, for one thing, and the advisory group is really the only sort of watching over of the agency, but yet has no real power. Not that I am thinking anybody's going to go crazy here, because I think everybody's very much on the same page as to what the goals are. Would you just speak a little bit, John, about the importance of the intent section of this because there is a check back through LCAR
For sure.
when it comes to rulemaking.
Yeah, so a couple of responses. One, your description is completely fair. The one qualification I might add is that there are required reporting pieces. So the agency would have to come back annually to the legislature to report on implementation of the program. So it's not entirely out of sight of you guys. But that's right, the policy statement, so section 1, the reason that the working group spent so much time on this is that there was a broad extension of rulemaking authority to the agency to develop this program. And so this was seen as the way to input the agency's interpretation of its rulemaking powers. And in particular, there are pieces that call out or cite to the specific section. So if you look at section 2, subdivision 2, the agency shall be responsible for adopting rules pertaining to school construction and capital outlay, including rules to specify a point prioritization methodology and a bonus incentive structure aligned with the legislative intent expressed in section 3440. So this is a way of not going all the way in legislative language, not going all the way to codify or put in statute particular prescriptive rules, but to say that the agency, as you develop these rules to implement the program, you need to pay attention to these particular standards. And this is, always done against the backdrop of, and why LCAR is so important, you can't impermissibly delegate authority to the executive. And so you have to provide adequate guidelines when you extend this kind of power to the executive. So this is that confining, cabining discretion piece that's happening in the bills proposed. This is what limits the agency's rulemaking power, but it would still need to go through the whole formal rulemaking process. There would be public comment, public hearing. It would still need to go before LCAR. So there would be multiple check-ins on this. So the set of review pieces, I think you could characterize the set of safeguards that are in place for this are 1, the advisory board that you've identified, 2, the regular reporting that's required, 3, the constraints through the policy section on how rulemaking will be developed, and the actual formal rulemaking process itself all kick in to cabin the agency's discretion for this proposal.
You guys did some good work here.
So, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
I don't, I'll follow up with you maybe, but maybe it's the two of you, because you were involved with this. Was it the intent to use a school construction aid program to support the mergers of school buildings or the shift in school buildings? Or was it the intent to encourage or to even potentially force and those things to happen? And then I'd love to hear what both of you say about that. And then I want to know whether there's any mechanism in this that could create one or both. Thanks.
I don't think it was any intent of force.
No.
At all. I do think there was intent to
Incentivize.
gently guide and incentivize some merging. If somebody were needing to qualify for school construction, they would have a different incentive level of cover. One of the priorities.
Yeah, I think certainly the intent was to encourage, and we didn't solve the challenge we're all in, which is that we wanted to both do that, encourage sort of where we're going to a future state, and the reality is the state that we're in right now, the need is dire, and so there's never going to be enough funding for either of those buckets of just what we need right now for deferred maintenance and what we need for encouraging this future state. So, I guess that comes down to the prioritization, the eligibility, the prioritization criteria, and the bonus incentives then, and how those get defined, because it has the potential to really go down one path or the other, and both are dire needs.
Yep.
So that's where I'd love to hear.
Yep. So I'll go out on a limb and respond to first the question that wasn't addressed to me, but in support of the legislative members of that working group. Entirely incentives, as you guys will recall. This program is for those availing themselves of state aid, otherwise it's not applicable. So you're not required to go through this route. You could take some different practice. So this is meant to be a carrot approach. There are a number of pieces that do speak to this consolidation concern. So if you look at the very end of section 1 of the statement of policy, this will be the top of page 2. Joint construction projects between 2 or more school districts and consolidation of buildings within a district where feasible and educationally appropriate are encouraged. And then I would note further on, let me make sure I just have this right. If we jump down to it's probably section 5, let me see. No, section 6, I'm sorry. Yeah, section 6. So if you jump to page 11, this is the eligibility section of the Secretary of Education's approval of a preliminary application. So you'll recall that there is this first piece checking on fulfillment of a set of needs. So an application that goes through this process will need to show that it meets a particular set of needs. That's what you see at the very bottom of page 10. So the Secretary may approve a preliminary application if the project or part of the project fulfills a need occasioned by, and then there's a set of 4 different needs. New language that the working group added, because that is existing law that you see those particular needs set out, is on page 11. This or the project results in consolidation of 2 or more school buildings and will serve the educational needs of students in a more cost-effective and educationally appropriate manner as compared to individual projects constructed separately. So what this particular provision does is that as there are a set of eligibility conditions that a preliminary application has to meet all of these eligibility conditions under current law and here, the first eligibility condition is this meeting a set of needs fulfillments. But the new language that's added here allows a project that doesn't meet any of those particular needs. So it's not deterioration of an existing building, it's not inadequate to provide programs under law. But if it results in consolidation and will serve educational needs in a more cost-effective manner, it could meet that as an eligibility condition, as an alternative to meeting those sets of needs. So this is added as an incentive to say, you may not meet the needs-based portion of our eligibility criteria, but if you are consolidating, you're going to satisfy that condition. You still have other eligibility conditions that you have to meet, so I don't want to say that you're just through the door at that point. But this was new language added to try to add encouragement to the process.
But it's still just encouragement.
Right.
And we all, in the past, we had a similar type, although we had more financial encouragement because it was 50%. As opposed to 30 if 2 or more had merged. What I guess I'm trying to get at is there anything in moving rulemaking to the agency that could, in the way we've written it here, that could
Absolutely. So the rulemaking would be developing the priority points and bonus incentives. So there's a base 20% figure provided covering eligible costs across the lifetime of the debt service for a project. So debt service lifetime costs. But there would be additional bonus incentives contemplated by the program that would add additional funds, additional state aid to a particular project, and that could be up to an additional 20%. No increments are specified, so maybe you're just getting 5% for something. But those bonus incentives, the additional dollars that are going, are under the current proposal going to be built out in rule by the agency as advised by the advisory board. The agency could permissibly look at the intent language in the first section and see this particular language about consolidation and the other conditions above, and include, as one of its bonus incentives, projects that result in consolidation. So there might be extra dollars available. It doesn't contemplate that there would be a requirement. That's not something that's built out here. But the agency could further incentivize consolidation through rulemaking.
So I think one of the big questions to ask ourselves is there a better way than to have the agency sort of develop a plan in connection with the advisory committee and then do rulemaking? I would say that the alternative to that is us doing it. But these would be things like creating, saying, all right, well, yes, if you bring 2 schools together under one roof, you get an extra 20%. You would be literally coming up with all of that. I think what is proposed here is very realistic and frankly doable if you give the agency the capacity to do it. But it's something that we would need to decide if that's,
But I think
that's the right route.
I asked the question because I think it has a great impact on, if we move forward, on whether there's an advisory board or not. I mean, I think the advisory board is a check and balance
Yes.
kind of thing,
Yeah,
which is,
Does anybody want to say that we shouldn't have an advisory board?
No, I agree with having, I agree with having.
No, you wanted it to have more power.
Right, and the question that I had when we made it an advisory board is was it gonna go on a perpetuity or was it gonna sunset?
Got it.
We decided to have a sunset at a certain point, at least to stand up this program and help get it going.
To Rhett Long's point, which I think is helpful for contextualizing kind of high-level thinking about how you might draft this program. The greater specificity that you guys took in the statute, for instance, if you spelled out all of the priority points and all of the bonus incentives and all that you left were kind of technical administrative pieces for rulemaking by the agency, the need for an advisory board might be significantly less in that context. So it's just to say that you could consider these in context, and if you go down the lane of building out a lot of statute and kind of limiting the agency's rulemaking power within this program to relatively technical pieces, then you might be looking at a different picture.
So I would just throw this out, and I don't mean it to sound, to steer your thoughts in any way, but if not this sort of
Then
method, then what?
Right.
How do the two of you sort of feel about what's in front of us? After having been through the, because I think that the idea was sort of like, well, this is more of a placeholder or whatever, but it's actually, seems to be a fair bit there. Anyone comment
I mean,
on it?
there's just some further context and background, we had testimony briefly from the state board that liked the concept of some other voice body being in it, if it isn't them with more capacity. We had testimony at some point from the AOE who worked really closely on the working group with us that liked having an independent body involved in overseeing some of the prioritization and how those are implemented. And if I think back to last session and this committee, I think there was a pretty strong feeling about having the kind of finance bond bank treasurer perspective really at the table here. Whether that, we probably need further testimony from them, we got it last year, but whether this really gets us there, but that there's a eye towards kind of the state finances that's so important and part of this. The head of the bond bank has been a really helpful thought partner in a lot of this. He uses this again and again, so I've written it down. Vermont school facilities are a liability that require a policy solution. Our current system is not keeping pace with depreciation and is increasing financial risk to school districts and states. It's been a pretty powerful reminder, and I think he has some innovative thinking around, how we could do some of this. So bringing that perspective, knowing whatever we create is probably going to be a pretty small office at the Agency of Education, and they're going to do most of the technical work. But having some of the other, those who are listed in this group, somehow eyes on the program helping steer this course has felt like an important part of what we didn't have previously and what we particularly need in this moment in time. But the other concept that was thrown out was do we want something as robust as the Green Mountain Care Board? Are we talking about that kind of a model of its interface with education? I don't know. That obviously we all know some about the Green Mountain Care Board right now, but a very professional,
Fully salaried,
right?
Yeah, and as far as, I had some different thoughts as we're going through the process, but I'm completely happy with where we kind of landed here. This really consumed a lot of our time in this group, was trying to come up with this advisory committee. I don't, and I actually like leaving it up to the Agency of Education to come up with those bonus incentives. I don't, personally, I'll speak for myself, I don't think I have the ability to decide what those are going to be. I think they're more in a place where they should be deciding based on a vision, right, of where we want our education system to be in the future.
And that envisions the AOE having additional staff people with expertise in this area.
Which is an important, as I think we're getting the formal budget request presentation from the AOE this week, so there's an important, through line that we need to follow, but the rough estimate was three FTEs. You do an office of at least 3 to sort of stand up and administer the program.
That being said, still open for suggestions.
Yeah.
What part of this proposal do you feel needs more attention from this committee?
Maybe I flip the question to the committee. Is it the role of, where do people feel comfortable in terms of the makeup of the committee or council and the role of the committee or council? Is there one or the other?
You're talking about the committee.
It's the advisory group. Like, are we, I suppose I would start with the role. Are we sort of at consensus that it's advisory? And then once you make that decision, sort of, then how do we feel about the people who have been put on it? What its purpose is probably matters before you decide who the people are,
I'm gonna
so.
flip that around.
Okay.
I think for me, like after I read it before, but hearing it again, the makeup of the committee, it is nice to hear that there's many layers of expertise in different areas, and I think that's important, that broad stroke. So for me, like the makeup of the committee, without putting any more thought into it, I like it. I think I could dig in a little deeper and maybe try and pull in some other thoughts from, different, like from construction and stuff like that from people in the field, but I like that. As far as their powerful role, as I said earlier, to me there's something about having that community be able to make those decisions and present them in a quicker manner than maybe a certain an organization that does many things can do, right? So I think having it as that advisory piece is important, or a decision-making piece. I'm not sure, but I like that it could be a committee that, or a group of people that can make a decision quickly when there's a need, quickly.
As we're having this conversation, and please continue, also think about and with that, I'd like to hear from so-and-so. It occurs to me, I think it'd be a good idea if we brought in Bob Johnson from AOE to sort of talk about, he's their sole employee dealing with this stuff. And he can sort of talk about what he does, his expertise, the kind of expertise they might be looking for if we were to staff it.
If I knew someone who, or had access to someone who could talk about from the contractor construction side who does schools, not just other regionally, who would I have them get in touch with if we wanted to hear from them? Just have them send an email to you guys?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And just so you know, so this committee, the House Education Committee has been dealing with this now. This is year 3. I'd say year 1 and 2, we heard a lot from Rearch and Truex Collins and a lot of people in the field.
To go back and listen to those.
In fact, Truex Collins was represented on the initial task force.
That's right.
Year ago, technically.
Well, yes, if you look at the makeup of the initial task force, you'll see broad representation from industry.
I'll go back and listen to some.
May I offer some things?
Yes, please.
So
Claim for landing.
the basis for a lot of the language that you see in H.129 is kind of the meat of the program under existing law is Title 16, Section 3448. And there were a few pieces of that that we did not really get to or spend time on. You don't necessarily have to address these pieces, but these are things that in the past the legislature thought appropriate to address in statute. So we didn't spend a lot of time on emergency aid. I know that that was a particular piece that is you're going to want to think about. Small pieces, and this may be easily disposed of through rulemaking, but eligible construction costs. Do you want to spell out particular space parameters, or is that just something that the agency should be dealing with?
Can
Under-
I stop right there? Traditionally, that has been the purview of the agency to decide what was eligible.
Yes, exactly. And so there's a provision in existing law to say that that's spelled out in rulemaking. That's not currently part of this proposal. That could very easily be added. This is just pieces we did not get to in the working group. Under existing law, there's a requirement for refund upon sale. So a school district that's selling off a school construction facility has to pay back the percentage of aid they received up to the max of the value.
But you say these things already exist.
This is what's on the books in Title 16, Chapter 123.
So if we did nothing, they would continue to be on the books.
Under the moratorium, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. The vision behind this proposal was that this would replace existing 123. It doesn't currently do that. There's no repeal language broadly. But what was, I think the thinking behind this was that you would be replacing the existing program. So removing things like the deferred maintenance requirement that would prevent almost any aid from happening under our newly instituted program. So I think spacing cost parameters, whether you want repayment as a condition of aid, how to deal with emergency aid would be particularly important pieces to address, or at least things that past legislatures have thought about in the context of this kind of program. And then maybe how to deal with CTE facilities is not something that we spent time on.
That's an important one to dive deeper into. There was discussion on the working group as well about independent schools and if they would have access to this in any fashion. If we didn't really dive into that, I don't know if we want to try to dive into that, but the CTEs for sure, I definitely would like to.
Yeah, I don't want to misstate the education proposal. I was reading through the packet earlier today, so I guess I should confirm this before saying it, but what I recall is that there's kind of a separate envisioned stream for CTE, and we had talked last week, I think, about how this kind of maintenance that we're talking about is not built into the funding proposal that's part of the program. The CTE stream may be different, so this would be worth looking at to see if the CTE funding stream does include extra funds for CTE facilities. Maybe you recall, okay.
I think so.
Why would we be treating CTEs any differently than any other public school?
I think we should. Yes. Yeah, they need help.
Yeah.
Different cost drivers.
Well, they definitely have different uses of their facility.
Yeah.
So do they get a, well, anyway, just a good question.
They should be in the mix. They're important. We need more.
Is there something in here about requiring districts to set aside 3% of their budget for maintenance in here? I just can't
I
remember.
don't think so.
I don't think there's, but is
Thought
that
that's
tied into the?
because that's in DQS, like
Okay.
if
I think
this all sort of assumes, well, and now DQS is on its way to becoming,
Starting
being implemented in July. So this assumes we're also in a future ecosystem with a bit better handle on our operations and maintenance budgets and maintenance and the kind of year-to-year oversight of our system. Obviously, that's not going to happen when you flip a switch on July 1. But
So I have a question for the two of you. The bill puts in a base amount of 20%.
yeah,
Why did you do that as opposed to just sort of making that all part of the AOE coming up with a point and award system?
I'm not sure why we decided to take that on ourselves, but there was a lot of discussion about what level, if there was a base, would entice people to want to, be enough to entice people, but also leave enough room for the bonus incentives and everything else in there. Because that's really what we wanted to focus on, with the bonus incentives, and that would be the kind of the driving factor of, how might we want to kind of guide school construction into the future.
it's not a super scientific number.
No.
The whole program was what, 30%, and so it was
Exactly.
like, oh, it's sort of like that, but a little less, but still sounds like
But
a lot.
wouldn't this theoretically allow a district to put in for a 20% base funding on a school that everybody can see probably shouldn't be there anymore. Because it's sort of like saying, well, anybody who wants to do anything
I think
that
that's,
qualifies is gonna get 20%.
Wouldn't
I
the,
think that's where
There's
the
a
whole
lot of
process,
criteria.
the application process
You wouldn't
probably
fit it.
would.
You wouldn't necessarily.
you wouldn't hit eligibility.
Right.
Yeah, there are strict eligibility criteria you have to meet, including meeting those 4 sets of, including that first needs-based piece or the consolidation. But there's eligibility criteria that you have to get through. There's considerations separate from eligibility, so they don't have to be met, but things that the Secretary thinks about when reviewing particular applications. And then additionally on top of that, there would be whatever pieces are built out through rulemaking. So if you feel content with the eligibility conditions, you don't have to have this particular concern, but if you are concerned about this, I would just encourage you to look at the eligibility conditions, which are, if you look at the bottom of page 10, line 18, that's where you want to look. So this is, it's not super, it's section 6, so it's section 3445, sub A, sub 2B. I'm just going through some.
I assume that includes like, you gotta have a facilities master plan.
Exactly.
Which would, I assume, make people think about what they're putting their money into.
Yep. So facilities master plan, achieving the level of proficiency in school district quality standards, fitness through those in lines 12 through 16, so need can't reasonably be met by another means. The proposed type, kind, quality, size, and estimated cost are suitable to the proposed curriculum and meet all legal standards. So you have to go through you have to fit through the funnel to get here. And if you are dissatisfied with the funnel, that is something that you guys would be equipped to change.
And we could, depending on what our process is next, be things worth asking, AOE too, because they worked on this with us a lot.
They
and
proposed
really,
the last of these eligibility conditions, those related to the proficiency, district quality standards, and the facilities master planning process. Those were both offered by, brought by Jill.
Yeah.
And I did just want to go back to the point about the CT facilities. I misspoke. You're absolutely right. There's no facilities piece of the budget in the education transformation proposal.
You had mentioned that one thing that wasn't in here was emergency aid, although there is a $100,000 emergency aid.
Yes. So that just duplicates. I don't think it's something that the working group spent much time on getting to, other than to point out that it required
Is
consideration.
Is current law 100,000?
Current law
It's some crazy low number.
is 100,000.
Oh, it is.
It's 100,000.
Oh, but we only fund it at $50,000 a year.
50,000's in mind.
And this was something where I don't recall the full context, but Jill kept mentioning this dual track model for particular kinds of projects. You'd have a project that could meet the traditional standards for funding through the program as envisioned, but you'd have another kind of different track for, I'm envisioning things like that don't necessarily meet existing rule standards for emergencies. I don't know if you guys happen to remember this, but there was envisioned a category of projects that the agency deemed to be appropriate for funding that are neither captured by the full application process or the emergency piece. And that's not included in this draft. And I don't know that the reason it's not included is not reflective of the working group rejecting that idea. It was just more didn't address that piece.
But I think they had talked about coming back to us, bringing back some more specific either language or plan or thoughts around this track of the work. And the Rhode Island program has like several spurs. This doesn't map completely on that, but I vaguely remember there being a sort of corollary in Rhode Island because they had those different funding streams.
I would say just my initial reaction is maybe that would muddy the water at this point.
Yeah, I think it was.
But if we can certainly add next year or whenever, if it seems like that's missing. This is a very good base piece for us to work on, which frankly we're finding little fault with. So just read it over, think about it, and what else we need to talk about.
I think probably then it's getting some of the feedback and testimony from the stakeholder groups that were outlined in our creation of this, to give feedback on it, and then, the money piece.
That's all it is.
Nice to make one.
Great. All right, we'll close, further questions, discussion?
I was just gonna mention what I mentioned before. If there were, if we were going to have this a successful program, and I don't know how it fits into this, but I'm gonna bring it up anyway. If there were guidelines or some help for municipalities on what to do with buildings that we
Yeah.
close, I just think
Yeah,
we want
that's
to keep
missing.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't even know if it belongs here or who would have sort of like, fill out. I don't know. I'm just worried about that piece.
No, if you want to hear somebody talk about that, the head of the bond bank is,
Oh, that's great.
he is really
That's good to hear.
on that. And as we were sort of talking with leadership about different committees in the House dealing with different things, I said that was a discussion that maybe the Commerce Committee could enter into. But I agree with you. I think that needs to be thought about in this bill. Yeah, absolutely.
Because I know there's there's questions that aren't getting answered.
So maybe this isn't responsive, but I would call out that under section 2, the list of responsibilities for the Agency of Education, there are particular provisions related to kind of outreach to school districts and technical assistance for both the application process and the school construction process, and 2 separate responsibilities. So if the thought was that this was going to be a hands-off program in which school districts are left to fight on their own, competing for funds, I don't think that's what's envisioned here. There's meant to be some hand-holding through the process, but you could further develop that.
Yeah, I think what we're talking about, and maybe this is something we could put in here, is that part of any application can include up to $50,000 for the community to re-envision a building that is closing.
Yeah.
And that's what you were talking about, right? It's really providing some significant help to a community that's.
Right. I mean, honestly, 50,000 would be wonderful, but even just guidelines around the process, because I'm telling you, I'm experiencing it in one of my communities that they basically voted no to close because they had no idea what they were going to do with it. They couldn't get any answers. Don't know.
They didn't know what they would do with a closed, empty building.
Yeah, should we do it for $1 or not?
Right.
And
Yes. No, I've been to towns where they have said, we will never buy back the building because the building
is in terrible shape. But to some communities, it makes sense to tear it right down. So we
which would
need
come at
help.
a significant cost.
Yeah. So just mentioning it, we want to help ease the process.
Okay, let's end there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, John.
Sure.